Starting today with some theme music, totally unrelated to course content. So let's talk about two of the big questions in philosophy of mind. The big question, I think, and I think this first one is the real true big question in philosophy of mind, is how is the mind related to the body or to the brain? As we'll see, each of these three views that we're going to consider is a big answer to that question. Another way to put that is how are mental states related to brain states, right? Because we all admit that we have mental states. There are some philosophers out there who actually deny that we have mental states like the ones we think we have, but we're not going to talk about them. We all admit we have mental states, but like beliefs and desires, and we take pleasure in certain things, we're pained by certain things, we have hopes and fears, etc. We reason through things, and we all admit that we have brains. And we all think that there's some sort of relationship between those mental states and the brain, and anything past that, we don't know. Are the mental states just identical to brain states? Is the mind just the brain? Are they two totally separate kinds of things on the other hand, or is it somewhere in the middle? Now here's a second question related to this first question. What kind of thing is the mind? Right? It's related because once you talk about what kind of thing the mind is, that's going to help you answer how that thing is related to the body or the brain, right? If it's just the same kind of thing as the brain, then maybe there aren't as many problems talking about how they can interact or how they're related. Maybe if the mind just is the brain, then of course it's the exact same kind of thing as the brain. But if it's a distinct kind of thing, obviously it's not going to be the brain. So those are very closely related questions. Second big question is called the problem of other minds, and there's three questions underneath this, right? Do other people have minds? Are their mental states like yours or like mine from my perspective? And how can we know whether they have minds and what they're like? Okay, this starts to sound like a little bit of a crazy question, right? But the way that I'm thinking about these sorts of questions is I'm not saying this is the way philosophers in general think about them, but the way I think about these questions is they are useful constraints. Having good answers to these questions are good constraints on answers to the first big question, how the mind is related to the body. So, yes, other people have minds, okay, of course. But we want any answer to the first question of how the mind is related to the body to be able to get that answer to the second question, right? So this is a way in which a question is not really open or interesting in itself, but it can be useful as a tool in answering a different question, right? So when we do ethics, for example, it's not really an open question whether we should, for example, we talked about the case of the child drowning in the pond, and I said, hey, should you help the child? Do you have an obligation to help that child? It's not an open question. Of course you have an obligation to help that child. And when we ask that question, do you have an obligation to help the child? It's not asking it as an open question. It's going to be a question that the answer is actually clear to, but that as a question, it's useful as a tool for answering other questions in this sense. If your theory of what we ought to do in general entails that we don't have an obligation to help that child in the pond, you've got a bad theory, right? And so we don't take ourselves to be crazy in virtue of talking about this question of whether we have an obligation to save the child in the pond, right? Because we know the answer, and any good theory should entail that answer. And similarly, we know the answer about whether other people have minds, and we kind of know the answer about whether their mental states are like ours. And any good theory of how the mind is related to the body should entail those answers. It should entail that other people have minds, that we have a way of knowing that other people have minds, and that their mental states are like ours, if that makes sense. So that's how I'm thinking of these two big questions. What that means is the first question is the question we're really interested in. Okay, so let's talk about our first option, dualism. The reason it's called dualism is because there are two fundamentally different kinds of things, neither of which reduces to the other, the mind and the body. So if you look at the bottom of the page, you'll see this view defined. The mind itself is a fundamentally different kind of thing from the brain. You see how that answer is 1A here, but it's also going to tell us something about 1 itself. So Descartes was a philosopher, a French philosopher, who is maybe the most famous proponent of this view. Not the first proponent of it. In fact, it's an incredibly popular view before Descartes, after Descartes. It's kind of gone out of popularity within academic philosophy, but it's still a very popular view in the world in general. And certainly the fact that academic philosophers don't like it is not that telling of a sign against it, right? Academic philosophers think lots of crazy things. But here's what Descartes said. Okay, so there's basically 2 steps here. So first, he says, well, I can imagine my mind existing without my body, right? I can imagine, maybe, your religious view entails this, so it's easy for you to imagine, but even if your religious view doesn't entail this, or you don't have a religious view, you can imagine those sorts of religious views being true, that there's a soul or whatever, that you could go on existing, having your beliefs and your desires or whatever, once your body dies and decays and all this stuff. You can at least imagine that. I'm not saying you have to think it's true, but if you think it's possible, then you're on the same page with Descartes. Descartes says, I think that it's possible. I can at least imagine it being true. Now, here's a big step that he makes in the argument. If you can imagine those 2 things coming apart, they're different things. If you can imagine the mind coming apart from the body and the body coming apart from the mind. So the second step we didn't talk about, you can imagine your body existing without your mind. That actually happens, right? When people go into essentially vegetative states, right? Their body is there. Now, maybe their brain is different, so maybe that's not the exact same case. So we're talking what Descartes might want is your body exactly as it exists now, being without your mind. And he says, I can imagine that too. Your body just is like a little, kind of like a zombie body. It's exactly like it is now, but your mind isn't there. You're not conscious. You don't have the beliefs and the desires and things like that. Maybe another way to get at that side of things, that possibility, is if we got really good at creating artificial, flesh and organs and stuff, you could imagine someone creating a body, and can you at least imagine that body not having conscious mental states? And Descartes says, well, yeah, I can imagine that. Okay, so maybe you're getting caught up there and you can't imagine those things, but step past that for a second. Suspend disbelief. Here's an important step to the argument. If you can imagine 2 things, if of 2 things you can imagine each existing while the other doesn't, those are 2 different things. That's a big argument. That's an important argument. Let's talk about why it might seem plausible, right? Let's see. Oh, here's a good one. We might wonder about what makes a football team a football team. So think about the Texas Longhorns football team. They're shedding players rapidly right now because the program's falling apart. But you might wonder, what makes the UT football team the UT football team? Is it the players? Is it those particular players and coaching staff? And then you say, well, hold on. Can I imagine the team existing without those players and that coaching staff? And the answer is yes, because as is probably fixing to happen, the coach is probably fixing to be fired, which means his whole staff is probably fixing to be fired, maybe a few exceptions. The players aren't all fixing to be changed over entirely, but a lot of them are fixing to change, and you can at least imagine all of them changing over, right? So they all happen to transfer. It's not very probable at all, but it's possible. And then a whole new crop comes in. Lots of transfers come in, and you get some incoming freshmen and some junior college transfers and whatever. You have a whole new football team, but it's the Texas Longhorns football team. It's the same football team, right? That's actually a tricky one, right? We talk about teams in 2 different ways. Like a school can have a team one year and then a different team, a different football team the next year because they have different players and stuff like that. Coaches will talk about, oh, I had my 96 team and then I had my 98 team, even though they were at the same school those 2 years. But we can also talk about teams existing across personnel change, right? The Texas Longhorns is a single football team. It's the same football team it was in one sense in 1956. And so what we did there was we said, well, can I imagine the team still existing even though the players aren't there and the coaching staff are not there? And we said, yes, so they must be different things. The team is not identical to its players and coaching staff. You can imagine, maybe here's the better way to go about it. You can imagine that team being the same team even with small changes in players and coaching staff. So, for example, certain players are fixing to leave, certain coaches are almost surely fixing to leave, but it's not going to be a complete turnover. Can you imagine that happening and it still being the same football team? Yes. So it's not identical to its existing roster and coaches. Okay, so that move we just did is similar to what Descartes is doing. You can imagine one thing existing without the other, so they must be different things, right? We can actually go the other direction on the football team thing too. Can you imagine those players and coaches existing and them not being the UT football team? Yeah, right? Because imagine they all graduate, the coaches get fired or whatever, and then they all say they even get together in the same room and they're hanging out, but they're not the UT football team anymore. So you can go both ways on that one too. You can imagine one without the other and vice versa. And you conclude on that basis, oh, so it must be that teams are not really identical with players and coaches, with the players and coaches that constitute them at any given point in time. And Descartes is doing something similar here. He's saying, I can imagine my mind existing without my body and my body existing without my mind, so they must not be the same thing. Now, a lot of people think this is a bad argumentative move. Even though it works in some cases, like the football case, not everything we can imagine being true actually could be true. You can clearly imagine certain things that are impossible, right? Like you might have crazy dreams where you imagine that water is not made of H2O at all. But there's no such world. Water is necessarily made of H2O. So a lot of people criticize this argument. But that's just the first step of the argument. We're not going to go into further depth than that. The second step, so all that does is it tells us that the mind and the body are different things. That's very importantly different from the claim that they're fundamentally different kinds of things, right? So I might learn that, let's see, players and coaches are not the same thing. That's an easy one, right? But that doesn't mean they're not. That doesn't mean that they're fundamentally different kinds of things, right? So let's talk about a kind of thing. That's just a type, right? A coach is a type of thing, right? There are individual coaches, and then there's the category coach, right? But to call something a fundamentally different, you can call things different kinds of things, and players and coaches are clearly different kinds of things. But there's this question, are they fundamentally different kinds of things? And what that's asking essentially is, at bottom, do they share a category, right? And at bottom, players and coaches do share a category. They're both people, right? So they are different kinds of things, but they're not fundamentally different kinds of things. They're both roles, actually, too. So they're not fundamentally different kinds of things for multiple reasons. They share multiple categories. So how does Descartes, so what he's argued so far is that they're different things. But what we just saw is that doesn't establish that they're different kinds of, that they're fundamentally different kinds of things. Well, here's his argument for that claim. He says mind and mental states have properties that nothing physical could have. Nothing physical can be conscious, intentional, or rational. Consciousness we have a pretty good grasp on, and to try to define it further gets us into controversy. Intentionality is when the property of mental states that they can be about things. That's a really kind of weird philosophical way of talking. But what we're essentially talking about here is your beliefs that you have are not just bare beliefs. Your beliefs are about things. You have a belief about this cup right here. You have a belief about the video feed you're watching, right? As opposed to like maybe pleasures and pains are not intentional states. Pleasures and pains are not about things, right? You can just feel a pain and it not have a content, so to speak. It's not about anything. A belief is about something. Here's a question, test yourself to see if you've got the distinction. Are desires intentional states? Beliefs are, because they can be about things. They're about cups and paper and video feeds. Pleasures and pains, at least often, are not intentional states. They're not about things. You don't have a pain about this cup, right? You just feel pain. So if you want to pause and think about it, think about it. Desires are intentional states. You have a desire for something, right? You don't just have a desire like you can just have a pain, right? Like you can just feel a pain and it not be about something. Can you just feel a desire and it not be for something? No, it's an intentional state. Okay, back to my screen sharing. And Descartes thinks, look, nothing physical could have irrationality, of course, we have a pretty good intuitive grasp on, and also would probably be hard to define precisely. But these are features that mental states have, but that nothing physical could have. Rocks and cups and things cannot be about something. They cannot be conscious or rational. And so that's his argument that not only are mind and body different things, but they're fundamentally different kinds of things. Okay, so let's run through a couple little problems for dualism, then we'll stop the video and start a new one. First question, I call these questions, but really they're supposed to represent problems for the dualist. Question one, how do the mental and the physical interact? Right? We don't really have a problem explaining how the mental could interact with the physical if we think that they're the same kind of thing. If the mental ultimately reduces to brain stuff, then it doesn't really confuse us how they could interact because they're not fundamentally different kinds of things. Let's back up a little bit. Clearly, the mental and the physical do interact. Your thoughts can cause you to do things. So your thoughts, the mental stuff is causing physical stuff, actions in the world, you know. Your hand to move, your foot to move, whatever. And it goes the other way too. The physical can cause mental stuff to happen. If you get poked with a pen or punched in the face, there's going to be mental states that are produced by that. Pain in the second case. Well, pain in both cases. Probably more pain in the second case, depending on what kind of pen we're talking about here. At any rate, there's this causal interaction between the mental and the physical. And if it turns out that the mental just is brain chemistry stuff, that's not confusing because physical events can cause physical events. But if they're fundamentally different kinds of things, if the mental cannot be reduced to anything physical, how does the mental and the brain, or the mental states and brain states, how do they interact? How does the mental and the physical in general interact? Seems like when we talk about cause and effect, we're talking about physical events. But the mental isn't a physical event, so how can it enter into causal relationships with the physical? So that's the first big problem. And the second big problem, I happen to think it's not as big of a problem as the text does, but I won't go into that. The text seems to, the authors of your text argue that dualists have a problem giving the easy answer to the second big question about whether other people have minds or minds like ours and how we can know that. Because we can observe brains, we can observe bodies, we can observe physical things and events. We cannot observe non-physical events and entities. So how could we observe enough to know whether other people have minds if minds are totally non-physical and non-spatial?